So this is Love, Chapter 13. Ferdinand, the Grand Duke of Malloy, straightened the scarlet sash draped over his torso and flicked a speck of dust off his sleeve. Given that this nonsensical search for the maiden with the glass slipper was all but finished, he hoped he could get the prince to listen to reason. Doubtful, but he would certainly try his best. The morning was slowly aging, bright white light filtering in from the palace's arched windows. After straightening his collar, Ferdinand turned to Charles' attendant, whose profile bore a striking resemblance to the young prince's. "What are you waiting for, squire? Announce me." The sure-footed young man marched to the side and knocked thrice on the prince's door before opening it. Then he cried, "Your Royal Highness, the Grand Duke." Ferdinand was surprised to find the prince leaning against a marble pillar, his face to the sun-filled window, reading some nonsensical philosophy book. Ferdinand couldn't make out the title occupying the royal's attention, but before Prince Charles had left the palace for his studies at the Royal University, he had spent most of his time avoiding his tutors and playing pranks on the staff. To see him this absorbed in a scholarly book so early in the morning surprised Ferdinand and worried him. The prince's years away had changed him, his exposure to Greater Aurelius clearly giving him ideas about how the monarchy needed to change. Ideas like welcoming commoners in the council, or rewarding merit over class, or taxing the nobles to distribute wealth among the poor. Ideas that Ferdinand knew he wouldn't agree with. "Ahem," began the Grand Duke. The prince flipped a page, absorbed in the book. A muscle twitched in Ferdinand's jaw. These young people are so rude these days, he thought, so easily distracted. Still, the Duke made no motion that he was irritated, and instead plastered on a smile. Heaven knew that any ambitious man who wanted the king's ear needed to master schooling his features into an expression of placid obesqueness, and by God he had. Besides, he was aware the prince was frustrated with him for failing to find the maiden who could fit the glass slipper. Indeed, after he declared to the king that the search was futile and over, Charles's expression grew so lost and forlorn, Ferdinand could hardly imagine the youth as a suitable sovereign. Over the past 3 days, the prince had become obsessed with finding the girl. So obsessed that he'd ordered the cursed shoe encased in a glass box to be displayed outside the palace in case the girl should come riding by and see it one day. A ludicrous idea. Ferdinand had almost laughed aloud when he heard it. The king's money was obviously better spent building defenses or encouraging relations with the neighboring kingdoms. But upon realizing the prince was serious, Ferdinand did not dare voice his opposition. He was too wise for that. Let the boy lose credit in the council's eyes. Let the council see, as Ferdinand did, that Charles was completely unsuited for the throne. In the meantime, the Grand Duke would orchestrate his own schemes, beginning with this morning's visit. He swept a bow. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for agreeing to this audience with me." "What is it?" said the prince, his gloom-ridden eyes only briefly flitting up from the book to meet the Grand Duke's. "Your Highness, I understand you are disappointed in my service." Ferdinand's words tasted sour, so he lifted his tone an octave, lest the ill flavor seep into his voice. "I wish to apologize for failing to find the maiden with the glass slipper." "Apologize?" The prince's tone was harsh. "Somehow I doubt that's the only reason you're here. Come, Your Highness, I realize you are distraught at me and at this entirely harrowing episode." Ferdinand's voice trailed off. Truth be told, it was most harrowing for him. Even now, days after his search had concluded, when he closed his eyes, all he could see were ladies' feet. All he could hear were the strident cries, "It's my slipper! It's my slipper!" Feet everywhere. It was the stuff of nightmares. Big feet, little feet, toes and heels, and calluses and ankles. He broadened his smile. "Can we not let bygones be bygones?" His plea did little to soften the prince, but Charles at least put the book down. "What is it you want?" Ferdinand drew a breath, the deep sort he always took before saying something important, something that needed to be said without pause. "Your father and I wanted to impress upon you a reminder that you are the crown prince, Your Highness, and only heir to our luminous kingdom. As such, it is your duty to consider marrying for the good of your country and your people." The prince pounded his fist on the table. "I don't want to hear any more of this." "But, Your Highness," Ferdinand persisted, "it would please your father. He has been rather distraught lately in private, so as not to worry you." Charles hesitated. Distraught over what? Aha, now he had him. "The Princess of Lourdes is quite a beauty," said Ferdinand instead, unrolling one of his several portraits he had brought. "And I hear the Princess of—" "Distraught over what?" interrupted Charles. "Ferdinand, if you are using my father as a ploy for me to marry a girl of your choice—" "Sir, I would never." "Then I'll hear it from my father himself. I do not need advice from you." "This is an opportunity for you to serve your country, your highness," Ferdinand said soothingly. "Aurelius is not as strong as it once was. You must consider the future." "I'll consider it when I hear it from my father's lips, not yours." Ferdinand's mouth clamped shut. When he spoke again, his voice was thin and tight. "As you wish, your highness. Now, if you excuse me, I understand when I've been dismissed." The Duke made a stiff bow, then stormed out of the room. "These young people," he muttered, when the prince could not hear. "They will be this country's ruin." His teeth gritted, Ferdinand continued down the palace halls, growing more agitated by the minute until he reached his offices. The first thing he did was pull up Dr. Coast's report on the king's health. "There have been little change in His Majesty's well-being. He has made a full recovery from the rheumatism he suffered this past winter, and any variation in his health, such as his recent poor sleep, may be attributed to stress. I have taken into account your concern and suggest that His Majesty reduces activity. But your Grace may be pleased to know that at this time it is not necessary for him to relinquish his appearances with the Royal Council. Rather, such stimulation may improve his condition." Ferdinand crumpled the note in his fist. Stress? What did these bumpkin physicians know? It was time for His Majesty to cease attending the council. King George had long since stopped adding any value to the meetings anyway. And now His Majesty refused to tea with him after dinner. Who knew I'd sleep better without listening to you prattle on about policy? Go speak with Charles instead. He's been eager to become more involved with the council. Charles, indeed. The prince's return from university had thrown a wrench into Ferdinand's plans, painstakingly constructed over months and months. Now, if the king were to suddenly retire, Charles would be poised to take over. And given the prince's evident dislike for him, there was a good chance he would have Ferdinand stripped of his power as the king's most trusted advisor and confidant. That absolutely could not happen, and he would see that it didn't. If nothing else, the Grand Duke was a man of carefully laid plans. His rise in court had been in part by the grace of his family name, but it had also taken years of meticulous engineering and carefully made alliances for him to gain the respect of the Royal Council. He would have to accelerate his plan, but how would he go about it without drawing suspicion? His evening teas with the king had been perfect, allowing him to slowly erect the foundation for his scheme. But that was no longer an option. Besides, the time for action was upon him. Ferdinand drummed his fingers on the table. "Recent poor sleep," the physician's note had said. Was it true the king was taking a draught to aid his slumber? That could provide just the opportunity he needed. Genevieve's new girl had all but inadvertently revealed critical information. "She takes a sleeping draught," the maiden had said, "the same one as the king." A sleeping draught was an unimportant revelation, one somebody else probably would have accepted from the girl as reasonable payment for installing her in the palace. But after years of careful observation within its confines, Ferdinand had learned that, more often than not, what seemed the most insignificant pieces of information could turn the tides in his favor. And he had a feeling that this one would play into his hands favorably indeed.